Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 70, and today we're going to be looking at views common to friend and foe. I've been looking recently at criteria in historical Jesus research and looking at the way that New Testament scholars work with these criteria to try and establish what they think Jesus said and did. And I have a generally fairly sceptical perspective to the use of these criteria, which we'll get back to a little bit later today as well. But one of the problems about a lot of recent discussion of criteria in historical Jesus research is that there's a sort of cliched set of criteria that people think that they use. There's a set number in the toolbox. Scholars particularly love the criterion of embarrassment, they particularly love the criterion of multiple attestation, and then on a secondary level they might pull in also the criterion of dissimilarity, which we've talked about in the previous episode, and so on. And what happens in this is that there are various criteria which are potentially really valuable that are not getting discussed at all. And it's one of those that I want to focus on in this episode. And it's the criterion of views common to friend and foe. Now let me just unpack this a little bit. When you have in historical Jesus research, when you've got two sources agreeing with one another, then that's potentially fairly helpful. But of course, as we saw when we looked at the criterion of multiple attestation, you need those sources to be independent of one another. But there's a way of nuancing this much more closely, and that's that sometimes in historical research, you're really interested where you have views common to sources that are broadly favourable to the character or the situation you're talking about, and sources that are antagonistic towards it. In other words, when you're doing history, you don't just look at the material that is produced by the winners, the material that is produced by those who are writing the propaganda. When you're looking at history, say we were doing a biography of Winston Churchill, we'd want to get a good range of opinions, wouldn't we? We would want to get stuff written by people who were broadly massive fans of Winston Churchill, and maybe one or two rather more negative portrayals. We get a much more rounded portrait like that. And we can, when we're doing ancient history, find it really exciting and really helpful where you have a source which is antagonistic, that is witnessing to the same kind of thing that you get in the sources that are favourable. The best way, I suppose, to explain this is to illustrate it. And one of the most certain things that we know about Jesus, surely, is that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified probably in the late 20s, early 30s in Judea in the first century. And he was crucified on a Roman cross, and that Pontius Pilate was in some way connected with this. But how do we know that? Why are we so sure about it? Well, one way we can be reasonably sure about it is that this is a view that's common both to Christians who are asserting that this is the case, but also to people outside the Christian movement who are asserting this is the case. One of the earliest sources for this is Tacitus, who in the early 2nd century speaks about Christ as having been crucified while Pontius Pilate was procurator in Judea. In other words, it's something that's shared both by Christian sources and non-Christian sources. But if one was worried that even Tacitus is a little bit too late and maybe he's getting his source of information from other Christians, you can go back even earlier than that and look at something like Paul's letters. And Paul is already struggling with the idea of how people receive the idea of the Messiah getting crucified. So in 1 Corinthians, he talks about how the cross is a folly to Gentiles, how it's a scandalon, a stumbling block to Jews. So everybody seems to agree that Jesus was indeed crucified on a Roman cross. It's how they interpret it that is causing the difficulty there. But no doubt what one might say in response to this is well, if all that this criterion can do is tell us that Jesus was crucified, then we're not finding out a great deal, because surely that's something which, if we don't know that, then we really don't know anything about Jesus. And I think that would be a fairly reasonable point, although I might want to say that the crucifixion of Jesus is always a great starting place for historical Jesus research. But what else can it tell us? Well, one idea that I've sometimes played with is the fact that Celsus in the 2nd century, Celsus is a pagan critic of Christianity, and Celsus in the 2nd century does repeat some fascinating rumours about Jesus, one of which is that Mary, Jesus' mother, had an affair with a Roman soldier called Panthera. And what's curious about this is that it's agreeing with the Gospels, with Matthew and Luke, that Jesus was conceived out of wedlock, that Jesus was an illegitimate child. And it just could be that what Celsus is doing there is witnessing to an early tradition, even though that tradition has been interpreted differently by Christians who are interpreting the thing as a virginal conception, and by pagan critics of Christianity, and probably Jewish critics of Christianity too, who see it as an actual affair. Now, the problem about this is that it's always possible that Celsus is simply taking something which was a well-known feature of early Christianity, the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin, and kind of warping it and engaging in a kind of scurrilous rumour, tittle-tattle kind of thing. But nevertheless, I do think it's interesting. It's potentially something that is shared by both friend and foe, and may just point to something that was at least widely known by people that talked about Jesus, that he was born illegitimately. Perhaps. I'm not going to put any money on that one, but perhaps that was the case when we're looking at this stuff. But if Celsus can help us on that, then what about other things that Celsus says? I should add, by the way, that Celsus, his work is not actually any longer extant in itself, and we only have access to it because the Church Father Origen wrote a refutation of Celsus called Contra Celsum, and that's hugely useful to us because when Origen does his refutation of Celsus's views, he quotes Celsus lots, so we have access to what Celsus said through Origen. So it's one of those things where, you know, we're grateful to Origen for writing the refutation so we can get access to what Celsus actually said. But it's interesting also that Celsus talks about how Jesus had learnt sorcery in Egypt. He basically could do these amazing miracles because he had learnt to be a sorcerer in Egypt. So he also has a negative take on Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker, as a healer. And maybe there's a little bit of history in that too. Maybe this is another place where you've got a view common to friend and foe, where Christian sources are speaking about Jesus doing miracles by the Spirit of God, whereas pagan and Jewish critics of Christianity are saying that he did this by sorcery, by magic, by scurrilous means. Again, maybe. I suppose with this one, what would help is that we can go and look at the Gospels and say, is there any evidence of views common to friend and foe that we see within the text of the Gospel itself? And there we do have something of real interest, because it seems to be taken for granted in one of the stories that appears in the Synoptic Gospels, the Beelzebub controversy. It's in Mark chapter 3 and parallels to Mark chapter 3. And one of the things that happens in that story is that Jesus' opponents say he casts out demons by the prince of demons. He casts out Beelzebub by Beelzebub. And what's kind of interesting there is that Jesus' opponents are depicted as agreeing that Jesus does these exorcisms. What's being disagreed on is the source of the exorcism. So Jesus claims that he is doing this by the Spirit of God or the finger of God. Jesus claims he's doing these by God, whereas his opponents are saying, no, he's influenced by the devil, by Beelzebub, by the prince of demons. But there's an agreement in that pericope from both friend and foe, from the writers of the story and the traditions that lie behind it, and those who are depicted in the story, that Jesus was some kind of exorcist. And so that might actually be some really interesting light on Jesus' reputation as a healer, as an exorcist at least, that as somebody who went around casting out demons, or as Mark usually calls them, unclean spirits. It's fascinating that you see that in these texts, underlying it, that there's a controversy there, and it's a controversy that may well actually go back to the earliest traditional material. So this criterion, view common to friend and foe, is one that I think is potentially helpful in historical Jesus work, and could point to quite a few different things. Now, the source, the best discussion of this is in Ed Sanders's and Margaret Davis's Studying the Synoptic Gospels, which is a book which I think is one of the best books you can read on studying the Synoptics. It's brilliant on the historical Jesus as well. For some reason, it doesn't quite have the degree of fame and adulation that it should have. I mean, I'm a big Sanders fan, as regular listeners to the podcast will know. But I mean, part of it I sometimes wonder is that the look of the book is absolutely hideous. It's a big square orange book, and a book shouldn't really be orange unless you can help it, and it's kind of square and it looks rather ungainly, and also it's tended to kind of go in and out of print and so on, but it's really an excellent book. And one of the things that they do when they're discussing the historical Jesus, they bring out this criterion as a way of helping us to do historical work about Jesus. And they suggest not only that the miracles themselves might be something that satisfy this criterion of view, comment, friend and foe, but also even that Jesus' preaching of the kingdom could be established by means of this criterion, because of Jesus being crucified obviously by opponents as King of the Jews. There's a connection there with Jesus' kingship or alleged kingship and Jesus' own preaching about the kingdom. There's a whole podcast we could have there, because there's all sorts of interesting things we could discuss about that. But what I really like is the way that they explore this topic. It is, of course, limited because there are only so many things that we could find out by means of this criterion. But also I want to add that looking at the Sanders and Davis book reminds us of something that I've said before about these criteria, and for me is one of the most important things of all. And this is that what Sanders and Davis are trying to do is they're writing what's basically an introductory textbook to tell you how to do synoptic criticism, to tell you how to do historical Jesus criticism, to tell you how to do redaction criticism, and so on. So the reason that Sanders is talking about this stuff in this book is because he's writing for new students. When he writes his big historical Jesus book, Jesus and Judaism, he doesn't have a great big discussion of criteria, because there what he's doing is he just goes in and behaves like a historian. You don't need to do like a little instruction manual about how to be a historian at the beginning of it. Whereas when he's studying the Synoptic Gospels, you're trying to train people to behave like historians. And it's particularly important to do that when it comes to historical Jesus stuff, because when it comes to historical Jesus stuff, people are often deeply theologically motivated or committed, and sometimes instinctively they find it harder to behave like historians when they're doing stuff with historical Jesus. But one of the things you have to say about any of these criteria is when you go into a history department, when you go and do history, they don't have a first or second lecture about criteria in historical work, and studying the historical Jesus is not in principle any different from other kinds of ancient history. I mean, yes, there are different challenges and there are different problems, but it's not in principle any different. We're still doing history. So this is the role that I see for criteria like view, comment, friend and foe. They help us to reflect on the task of being a historian. But if you then make these criteria an end in themselves, if you make them something that act as the specific tools that you think you can use to isolate authentic tradition and distinguish it from inauthentic tradition, then you're really using blunt tools and you're over-optimistic about the ability of these tools to do stuff. At the end of the day, we just need to behave like proper, normal historians. And if the criteria help us with introducing that task, well and good, but we mustn't push them too far and we mustn't think that they're able to do more than they can. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. That's now the 5th episode that we've had on the issue of criteria in Jesus research. We'll probably move on to something else next time, something a little different. But it's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com or hop over to iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. The Facebook page is at NTPod, Twitter page is at NTPod2, and I'll be along again soon with a fresh episode. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.